Let's go. This is a little video about how I made Fluffy. This one. You might have seen him somewhere, either at Dinosaur or on TikTok, or Instagram or YouTube or whatever. So let's just go through it. So to start the project off, we looked at inspirations and where we'd started. And so I have a background in 3D design for A-level. So I looked at sort of architectural stuff. I also liked the environment, so I looked at waste and stuff. Big inspiration was Stan Winston Studios, who make animatronics and puppets and all sorts for some of the biggest films, most notably Jurassic Park. Here's a little Jurassic Park mood board. A little look into more animatronics and machines and sort of the inner workings of them. Looking at natural inspiration, nests, colours, egg patterns, more stuff that's a bit more gruesome and horror-y. So I did a visit to a museum, sort of quite local to me, which is called the Booth Museum. Here's some sketches I did there. So it's mostly skeletal stuff. There's some models. So to decide on a puppet, I made a series of sketches for different animals that have lived in the United Kingdom in the past or now. I mean, only one of these is extant. They all have really different and interesting silhouettes. So we start off with the Eurasian lynx, which became extinct relatively recently. It's got these little ear tufts, it's got quite a short, stubby face, and it would make quite an interesting puppet. And it's sort of elusive, and so it could be a bit creepy. We've got red foxes, which have pointier ears, a longer snout, and they're a bit smaller, but they could be a bit creepy in the right scenarios. We've got the Eurasian grey wolf, which has been extinct for quite some time now, but it's got it's got a broader snout, it's got rounder ears, it's generally larger, and wolves quite often are associated with horror and aggression and stuff. Something that went extinct a bit longer ago, we got straight-tusked elephants, which obviously are much larger and more imposing silhouette. Maybe a bit impractical to turn into a puppet, but would be quite interesting. And then I looked further into the past to the Jurassic and Cretaceous and looked at 3 small theropod species: Vectoraptor, Dracoraptor, and Proceratosaurus. Vectoraptor from the Isle of Wight, Dracoraptor from Wales, and Proceratosaurus from Gloucestershire. I thought all of these were quite interesting. They've got very different silhouettes, with Vectoraptor being quite slender and narrow, Dracoraptor being a bit sort of blunt, and Proceratosaurus obviously having the big crest, which makes it really distinct. To get a better idea of the silhouettes, I roughly went over and made them fully black. This also helps to break them down into their most recognizable features. To actually figure out which one to pick, I ended up asking a bunch of my friends, putting up some polls, and the most popular picks ended up being Dracoraptor and Proceratosaurus. So I decided to go for the Proceratosaurus because it's the most visually interesting. The large crest makes it stand out and makes it seem more unfamiliar because there's not much like that. I wanted to strive for accuracy in this project, so I looked at what not to do and tried to avoid common tropes like shrink wrapping, which is seen a lot in the Jurassic franchise especially. Another thing I didn't want to do was expose teeth and lack of lips, because it's pretty concrete now that Dinosaur had lips, so I wanted this to be something represented in the puppet. So while planning the puppet, I sort of thought about how it could sit on my hand, and thought maybe I could make it out of laser cut wood and then cover it in a foam or a clay shell and carve it in shape. It might be tricky to make it properly symmetrical, and it would be quite likely that it'd be quite heavy and maybe not that strong, but I did draw up some rough sketches of how the internal structure might look to keep the crest strong. Another idea might be to use a structure of cardboard and cover it in a material like mud rock or paper mache. However, that would likely be not very strong and not be very detailed. The final thing I came up with was fully modeling it digitally and then 3D printing it. This would mean it would have perfect symmetry in its form and have a full level of detail with the scales and the teeth. I think it would be possible to make it quite light and strong enough as well. To make some rough test models, I first experimented with maybe making something I could laser cut. So I made this sort of thin structure which went throughout the crest and with incremental arches to support the general shape of the head. I then actually screenshotted these and printed them out, cut them out, and tried to make it out of grey board. It helped me realise that this was definitely a good size for the puppet, but unfortunately this model was really flimsy and the jaw mechanic had far too much friction to hold together. When I started 3D modeling it, I made quite a rough model initially with no detail in scaling or whatever. So from this render I made, I did some rough ideas for different colorations, mostly looking to nature and specifically birds for different patterns and colours. Hornbills I found really interesting with lots of crazy combinations of colours. I initially went with a combination of sort of red and black for patterning, thinking that I would get some black fur and I would paint it mostly black to sort of blend in with shadows and the red sort of popping out from that. I really like how some of these turned out, especially this one based on a Muscovy duck with sort of a red snout ended up going out into patches across the face. I decided to sculpt the rest of the body for the Proceratosaurus as well, just roughly, so I could maybe use it for some larger renders to integrate it into different environments. Cheeseburger. After having a look at what colours might be more common in nature and trying to apply that to the design, I sort of settled on sort of beigey colours and more earthy tones mixed with orange and red. I then experimented with more different patterns and combinations to try and find something I was happy with. So I made a quite rapid series of drawings of different ideas, looking at other references and just sort of trying out everything. I ended up tied between these two, which I most liked, and I put more effort into them. So then it was time to start sort of sculpting in different details. But first I ended up making the eye a bit bigger, as I think I made it far too small. To sculpt in the detail, I had to sculpt every individual scale and sort of draw around it and then sort of pinch all the vertices towards each other. To do the texture on the crest, what I ended up doing was using a sort of cloth simulation brush to sort of make it have sort of folds and creases and wrinkles in it to mimic that keratinous sheath or casque. I used things like cassowaries as references for texture. After doing all this texturing, I printed out another smaller test and I was happy with how it looked. So then came printing it full scale and it was going to take a while. I ended up printing the lower jaw first and it took about 6 hours of printing and ended up weighing about 100 grams. For the rest of the head, it took a lot longer. It ended up taking about 11 hours and weighing about 250 grams. But it ended up looking a lot better than it would have if I'd made it any other way. I glued the pieces together, I primed it, and then I had to add a little strap underneath the chin. So then I started painting from my reference image. I ended up going with this one because I really liked how the red flowed around it. I started with the light colours and then worked down to the darker colours. I ended up sort of going through and darkening some of the colours a few different times, and then I started with the extra dark colours around the crest and then added in the red. After I was done painting the head, I went in, painted the eyes, and then did the inside of the mouth. I also added some black around where the fur would be, just sort of try and blend it more into the head. So for the neck, I needed some way for it to be supported because I knew if I just did fur, it would deform quite a lot. So I ended up getting some thin upholstery foam and I cut it to shape and sewed it together. I then cut sort of slits into the top and the bottom to allow it to curve, and then I had to source the fur. So I ended up narrowing down to these 4 faux furs. I ended up going with this fur called Brown Peacock. It looks really nice. It's sort of a bit mottled, it's a bit spotty, and I think it suits it well. I had to cut out where it would fit onto the head. I made this sort of pattern which I wrapped around the head and stuck on and then drew over it. I then laid this over the fabric and tried to cut it out without making too much mess. With the foam, I just glued it onto the plastic, and I had to make some of the bands of foam a bit smaller so that they could fit together better. And I also added a bit inside the head to make it more comfortable to hold. Then came attaching the fur, and I didn't really account for this, but it ended up being a little bit too small. Then, yeah, that's mostly it done. I took a lot of photos outside in the sun, sort of seeing how it all worked, and I really like how it turned out. He has affectionately been named Fluffy. And then, yeah, here's a bunch of the photos. Creating him into more man-made environments. Here's one of the renders I made of the full body model in an environment. This one doesn't have the colours, unfortunately, but I really like how he looks at the end of a sort of tunnel. Here's a completely digital one I made with a digital background as well. And yeah, so that's how I made Fluffy. It was a really fun process, and I'm glad I did it. It was so fun to be able to bring something back to life, and I think it turned out amazing. Fluffy features in a little short horror film, which you can see on my YouTube channel, The Nova Entity. Thanks. See ya.